Yeah, we're going to talk about local storage when we get to client-side authentication. It's one of the later sprints. But it's actually really simple. I'm surprised you weren't able to get it working. I can show you really quick. Just really quick, if you just open up your console in the browser, open up your console, and you can just actually set local storage right from the console. There's a global keyword called local storage. And it's really simple to set stuff to local storage. All you have to do is say local storage dot set item hello, and then you give it some kind of value. Hello world. That's it. Okay, and if you want to retrieve that value, you just say local storage dot get item hello. All right, that's really all it is. Local storage is just a native API to the browser that should be really straightforward to use. So if you're doing any more than this, just revert back to the basics and hopefully you can get it to work. All right. The point of it is for persisting values. All right, so if you close your browser, your local storage value should remain when you open it again. We'll get to that all later, in some later sprints. So can we go over lifecycles with hooks as well? Yeah, we kind of did that on Tuesday when we showed the side-by-side comparisons of a class component and a hook component. We can do that again a little bit tonight. I don't know if that's helpful. I know you can't mix hooks inside class components, but can you pass a class component to a functional component? Yep, absolutely. You can use class components and hook components together. Like you can put a hook component in the JSX for your class component and vice versa. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that. That's totally valid. A component is a component no matter how it's created. So you can still use components in your component tree no matter how they were created. All right. You just can't mix them together. A component can't use both hooks and be a class component, right? You have to choose one or the other when you're creating your component. But you can use them just as a component. After they're created, you can use them any way you want. Is there a reason to use fetch instead of Axios? No. Personal preference of the team that you're working on. There's an argument that fetch will eventually become the native API in browsers for making a network request. But as of right now, that hasn't happened yet. So really, you can use whatever library you want. Axios does have more features than fetch, but I mean, if you don't need those features, then it really just depends. Where do we need to use prevent default? It's inside handle submit or wherever you click the button. Yeah, so you need to use prevent default when there is ever, when you trigger an event on something that already has some kind of a default action. Right, so links, for example, their default action is to send you to our URL, right? Forms have a default action to submit and send the form data to another URL and refresh the page. Buttons sometimes have a default event as well. And for those elements that you have events on, those are the ones that you need to prevent default on if they have any kind of default functionality to them. Usually it's best practice to just prevent default on everything. Every element is going to have that function on there, and you can just prevent default on anything. But it really matters when you're working with something that has some kind of a default functionality, right? Like forms or links. So if you want to just play it safe, just put prevent default on everything. Every event that's triggered by some kind of a user interaction. Am I going to do the Henry Potter project? I don't know what that question means. Henry Potter. I don't know if that's a typo, if you're just trying to be funny, but I don't know what you mean by that. Tonight we're not going to be working on that project. We're going to be working on the we're going to be working off a little bit off of the project that we did on Tuesday, and then we're going to start a new project from scratch. And I already answered that question. Stephen, is it considered best practice to put all of your functions up in app, or is there a use case for more selectively declaring functions inside of nested components? I'm not really sure what you're asking there, Stephen. Maybe you can clarify that question a little more. Are you referring to like the file structure of your project, or what do you mean? You can just type it into Slack. Maybe clarify that question a little more. Question below that, class component versus React component. What's the main difference? Why do we need to learn class component? Well, we covered that on Tuesday. That's pretty much what the entire lesson was about. So we'll do a quick review before we get started tonight, hopefully answer that for you. Is it possible to use things like material UI with classes? Yep. Class components have the same functionality as hooks and functional components. So you can use, you can use material UI, you can use Axios, you can use any third-party library. That's no problem. Oh, I see what you're saying, Steve. I see what you're saying, Steven. Probably not a good idea to just load everything up in app. I mean, if you have a child component that relies on a function that nothing else relies on, then it's probably best to put that function in the child component itself rather than app, right? Yeah. Keep your components, you should always keep your components self-contained unless they share functionality with other components. If they share functionality, then you can put the functionality in the closest parent component. But other than that, try and keep your components self-contained. All right, let's do a quick review. On what we talked about on Tuesday. So before hooks came along, what were the differences between functional components and class components? Explain to me what was the difference between a functional component and a class component? This is before you had hooks. What could class components do that functional components cannot? Right, yep, class components can hold state. What else? Life cycles, good, Dennis. Yep, state, life cycles. Functional components couldn't handle these things before. Okay. And how do we mimic the functionality of class components in functional components now? How are we able to get access to those things? Hooks, yep. Hooks are things like use state. Remember the use state function? There's the use hook, or the use side effect function, use effect function. Yeah, those are what's called hooks. Okay, that's how we mimic the functionality of our class components in our functional components. All right. What's a lifecycle event? One sentence real quick. What's a lifecycle event? Yeah. Basically anything that has to do with the life of the component, right? When it's created, when it updates, when it gets destroyed. Yep. A life cycle of, well, those are the life cycle. That's the life cycle. Life cycle events are essentially functions that we can define on our component to tie into those life cycles, right? To run specific code when those life cycles occur, right? That's a life cycle event. Cool. What does the keyword super, when we have a keyword super in our constructor, what does that mean? Keyword of super. Yep, super is needed for the constructor, right? When we create a constructor lifecycle event, which occurs when our component is created, when we call super, that allows us to call the constructor of the parent class, of the parent component class. The React.component, remember? That component that React gives to us. When we call super in our constructor, that's calling the constructor on the parent class, which gives us access to props, the lifecycle events. It basically allows us to access everything that constructor creates for us. Yeah, exactly. It allows this dot something, this dot yada yada. Nope, the constructor is not needed. Constructor is optional. We'll get into that tonight, Robert. Okay, so how do we set up state in our class component? How do we create some state? This dot state, right? Where do we put that? In the constructor. How do we update our state? If we have a new state value that we want to change on our component, how do we update our state? Set state, right? We have to call this dot set state. Why can't we just manipulate the this dot state object? Why can't we just change the values in that directly? Because React doesn't like that, right? Actually, React doesn't really care. React doesn't care if we do that. It just doesn't know about it, right? If we change this dot state dot something manually, React has no idea that that value changed, right? So we can change it all we want and nothing will ever happen. Okay, we have to change our state through set state in order for React to be aware of that change, right? Otherwise React doesn't know about it. Because I told you so. Yes. Good answer, Tim. Cool. Well, yeah, you guys seem to have understood everything we talked about last time. Are there any follow-up questions before we get into the new material? We're going to be delving more into lifecycle events tonight and just the entirety of the React lifecycle. But any questions before we can get into that? Venki, we can't mutate the state because React doesn't know about it. We can't mutate that object directly, that this.state object that we create in the constructor. If you change that directly, React doesn't know about that change, okay? So in order for us to change it in a way that React knows about it, we have to use this.setState. That as well, Stephen. Yep, that's a definite benefit. All right, cool. So, new material for tonight. Actually, before we jump into it, we're not going to do this right away, but later on in the lecture, we're going to be building a React app from scratch locally. So, if you could just go into your terminal and run the create React app command to create a new application, just so it can be running and we don't have to wait for all of the node module installations to finish when we actually get to it. So if you just want to go into your terminal and go into your terminal and just create React app, or however you're creating your local React apps. If you're using Yarn, create React app, or NPX, create React app, or just the global create React app. Create a new one and call it the dog website. All right. Do that and just let it run while we talk so that it can be finished by the time we're ready to jump into it. The only dependency we're going to need is Axios. So if you want to also npm install Axios after your project is set up, do that as well. So cd into the project, the dog website, and npm install Axios as well. So just those two, if you could just run those, have them running so that they're ready when we get to it, that would be awesome. All right, so we learned about the life cycle events a little bit on Tuesday. We didn't really go that much in depth, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into them tonight. And new life cycle events. So we talked about the constructor and the render function, right? But we're going to dive into some more specific life cycle events that class components give us access to. So life cycles are really the way, they're really how our components are operating under the hood. And when we dive into some of the more complicated life cycle events, it helps us understand how and why React behaves the way it does. It can sometimes be mysterious how React is behaving at the time if we're not sure what's happening under the hood. So learning these lifecycle events, even though you're not going to use class components if you're building a new React app, if you're using hooks, knowing these lifecycle events and what's happening under the hood at certain times is going to help you understand just React as a whole. All right, so even though the stuff that we're teaching in this lecture and the last lecture, even though they're based around class components, you're still going to use that knowledge when you're using hooks, when you're using hook components. Even if you're not specifically writing class components, you're still going to need the fundamental idea of what's happening under the hood. So, yeah. So lifecycle events help us understand what's happening under the hood with React. So that's life cycles. Lifecycle events are how we tie our code in to run alongside these life cycles, right? So you have the life cycle of created, right? That's the life cycle of a React component when it's created. The life cycle event of that life cycle is going to be the constructor, right? And then you have the rendered life cycle event, the life cycle, or the render life cycle. And the life cycle event that ties to that is the render function, right? So you have these life cycles, and then you have these methods that you can define on the class to tie into those life cycles, right? These life cycle events. It's kind of like a React API. It's the React API for us to access these life cycles. So we worked with the constructor and the render function on Tuesday, but there's a bunch of different ones that we're going to look at tonight that help us tie into more specific life cycle events. So there's a lot of stuff to learn with life cycles and life cycle events. We're not going to go as in depth as you could tonight. So if this whole concept fascinates you, I would definitely recommend looking into it more and reading about all of the different life cycle events and what's happening under the hood and how we can kind of control them with code. A good place to start would be this Medium article that I'll post in Slack. This is also in the training kit. So when you get some time, maybe after this lecture or tomorrow, make sure you go through and just read this Medium article and try and get a feel for how a lot of these different life cycle events are working. All right. So talking about the life cycle of a component, there's essentially 3 phases. All right, if you look in the training kit, they have this diagram right here. These are the 3 phases of a life cycle, of the life cycle of a component. And there's also this website that you can check out. It's a little bit more interactive. It's kind of cool. So if you want to open up that link, and we'll talk about these 3 different phases. So you can kind of think of this as the life of the component, right? Some of you mentioned earlier that you can kind of think of it as like the birth and the growth and the death of a component, right? This is the life story of a component. And inside each of these phases, there are certain events that run. Okay, so let's look at this first phase of a component's life. Okay, so the component is born, it's come into the world, right? We now have this mounting phase that takes place as soon as it's created. All right, so the component is being created. It's getting ready to be displayed to the page. React is getting it ready to display. and our constructor is going to run. That's going to be the first thing that runs in the life cycle of our component. Okay, the constructor is invoked. And this is where we're going to create some initial data. We're going to create our state. We might bind some class methods to the class itself. There's a lot of stuff we can do right there in the constructor as soon as it's created. Okay, and then as soon as this constructor finishes running, then it moves on to the render function. Okay, it'll run the render function as soon as the constructor is done. This is the initial render of the component. And that triggers React to update the DOM if necessary. Okay, and then once the render function finishes running and the component is displayed in the DOM, it's then considered mounted, and the component did mount lifecycle method. This is another method we can define on our class component. This method would then get called, saying the component is now mounted, do something, right? So what's the difference between creating and mounting? We've talked about this several times. Explain to me really quick, what's the difference between creating a component and mounting a component? Difference between creating and mounting. Good, yeah. So when it's created, it's just in the memory, right? It's not displayed on the page, it's not in the DOM. Versus mounting, which means it actually goes into the DOM and it's being displayed on the page, okay? So it's created during the constructor. That's when the component is actually created. That's when it's born. And then it gets mounted when it gets displayed on the page. Cool. And it's important to note that this first phase of the component's life, this mount phase, this only happens one time in the life cycle of the component, right? You can only be born one time. This component can only be born once, okay? And then once it's born, once it's mounted, then that phase does not run any longer, okay? So this only runs once at the beginning of the component's life cycle. Yeah, I mean, depending on your religious beliefs, components don't believe in reincarnation. So once it's birthed, it's done. And this mount phase is not going to run again. All right. And then that moves us on to the second phase of our component's life cycle, which is the updating phase. All right. Oh, the UPS man is here. So the updating phase is the second phase of the life cycle. This is something that can happen several times throughout the life of the component. Okay, this happens many different times. So essentially something happened in the component which is causing it to update, right? It received some new props, or something called set state, or something called force update. Don't worry about force update because that specifically it's pretty rare to use that. Essentially, you can call that and force the component to update without receiving any new state or props. But essentially, this phase will run if any of these events happen. So if new props come in, if set state is called, this update phase is then going to run, all right? And when it runs, it's going to call render again. So it will call render and it will send that JSX down to the DOM. Okay, and then it will call component did update. That's another lifecycle method that we can tie into. Component did update, all right? And that runs anytime our component re-renders, anytime it updates. If you click on this checkbox that says show less common life cycles, you'll see there's also some less common life cycle events that we can tie into during the updating phase. Specifically, there's one called get derived state from props. There's one called should component update. Should component update is actually kind of cool because it allows us to control whether or not our component updates or not, whether it re-renders. If you return false from that lifecycle event, then the component won't actually re-render. It allows us to stop it. Okay, so if we go through that component lifecycle, function, and we allow it to update, then it goes on to render, and then it goes down and eventually ends up calling component did update. All right. And then it re-renders, and then the component re-renders. React updates the DOM and calls that method. Okay, and this phase can happen many different times. There's no limit to the amount of times a component can re-render or update. No, the UPS guy was actually picking up a package. He wasn't dropping one off. Otherwise, I would go get it and open it in front of everyone. I hope that was the UPS guy. Maybe it was just like some homeless dude that dressed up as UPS so he could pick up packages. Yeah, Justin. Justin understands the world. All right, any questions so far about either of these first two life cycle phases? Any questions so far? Someone asked, is that virtual DOM? I don't know what you're referring to. This whole diagram here, this is not the virtual DOM. This is just the React lifecycle. The virtual DOM it gets updated right in this spot right here. You know, after the render function, React updates the DOM and refs, pulls everything from the virtual DOM and merges it into the real DOM. Okay, so I'm not sure what you're asking exactly there, whoever asked that, but I think if you have a more specific question, feel free to post. Okay. What are refs? Refs, that kind of goes out of the scope of this lecture. I'll answer that later on so we don't get distracted. All right, so let's talk about the third phase now. So we move on from the updating phase, the re-rendering phase, we move on to the last and final phase, which is the unmounting phase, right? This is the death phase of the life of the component. This is when it dies, okay? Essentially, the component has been removed from the screen, maybe as a result of a ternary in your JSX. Maybe you have a ternary that conditionally displays the component, and that ternary becomes false. That component is now dead, right? And with its dying breath, it calls this component will unmount lifecycle event. Okay, so with its dying breath, we're able to run some cleanup. Maybe we want to remove some event listeners or close a WebSocket or some kind of cleanup. We're able to run that really quickly before the component actually unmounts, before it actually dies. Okay, so that's the last lifecycle event that we have available to us. That component will unmount. You notice that it's not component did unmount like the other ones, right? You have component did mount, component did update. It's not component did unmount, it's component will unmount, because it's kind of like a dying breath, right? It's the last thing that it's going to do before it destroys itself. And after it's destroyed, it no longer has a life cycle, right? It no longer has a life that we can tie into. Are mounting and updating phases happening continuously or simultaneously? No, they are not. Remember, the mounting lifecycle event only happens once, right at the beginning of the life of the component. Okay, it happens as soon as it's created, and once it runs, that's it. It never runs the mounting phase again. The updating phase runs right after that, and it can run over and over and over again, but they run in order, right? They're never going to run at the same time. All right. So this is the life cycle of our component. This is essentially the life story of our component. It's kind of sad, right? To see this component brimming with life, doing all these cool things, and then it gets unmounted, and then that's it, right? But it's okay because more components will come along in its wake. But essentially, this is the life story of our component. And all of these lifecycle events, the component did mount, component did update, the constructor, render, these allow us to kind of take a peek at, and in some cases alter the component's life story, right? So it's how we see what's going on in its life and how we can potentially influence that. Yep, Benke, so component did mount only runs one time throughout the life cycle of the component, just once. All right, so real quick, what are refs? I don't know who asked that, but let me just explain real quick. Refs are just a way for us to access actual elements on the DOM. So remember, we're mad at the DOM, we don't talk to the DOM, but sometimes there might be an instance when you have to talk to the DOM. And in that case, you have to use what's called a ref in React. Okay, so if you don't understand that right now, don't worry about it because it's out of the scope of this lecture. But whoever asked that question, just know that refs allow us to access actual DOM elements in our React app. All right, so let's jump into some actual code. This is the project that we worked on Tuesday. We're just gonna look at it real quick and maybe implement some of these lifecycle events. So if you want to open it up, fork it, do your thing. So let's look at the constructor first. I mean, we already kind of know about this one. So kind of take this as a quick review. So when does the constructor get called? When does our constructor get called on our class component? Not when it's mounted. Nope. Right before it gets mounted, right? When it's created, during the component's birth, right? So what's the difference between creating and mounting? Those of you that answered with mounting or mounted, explain to me the difference between creating and mounting. This is an important concept that I'm going to drill into your minds. Yep, good. Creating is when it gets created in memory, when React actually creates the component. Mounting is when it goes into the DOM. Good. So the constructor is when it's created. Constructor maps to when the component is birthed, when it's actually created. Okay, created in memory. It's not mounted yet, it's just created. Do you think we should ever make, say we wanted to make an Axios call to an API, should we do that in the constructor? No? Why not? Why shouldn't we put an Axios call in the constructor? There's a lot of reasons why we shouldn't put an Axios call inside of the constructor. Essentially, the component has been created. We don't know if it should be mounted or if it's ever even going to be mounted. We just know that it was created. So we don't want to call an API endpoint if we don't know that the component is ever even going to be mounted, right? So we can use our constructor to create some state, create some initial data. We can also use it to bind our class methods if we don't use an arrow function, right? I showed you this really quick on Tuesday. If we had like some class or some method here, we can type. And if we defined it without using an arrow function like toggle item, then we would have to bind that method to the class in the constructor. So we'd have to go into the constructor and say this dot sum method equals this dot sum method dot bind this, right? That's essentially setting the context of this inside of some method, so some method can then access like this dot state. Otherwise, this dot state won't be anything. Okay, but if we use an arrow function like toggle item, then that automatically binds the value of this to that method, right? So those are some things that the constructor is used for. It's important to know that the constructor is optional. When you define a class component, you absolutely don't have to have a constructor. You can leave it out and it would work just fine. Okay, and even if you're only using it to set state, like in this instance, you might sometimes see the constructor just completely left out and state defined on the class like this. State equals some kind of state. And that has the same effect as defining state in the constructor. Right? The constructor is optional. You don't need a constructor to create a class component. But if you need to do specific things during the construction of the component, if you need to create some initial state, if you need to bind some methods, then that's when you're going to do it inside the constructor. Yeah, this is just newer syntax right here. Okay. Or maybe you want to call the parent constructor with some parameters, right? Then you would have to define a constructor in that instance. There's reasons to use a constructor, but it's not always necessary, so you can leave it out if you don't want to use a constructor. Yep, exactly, Danny. If you're not using an arrow function, you have to bind something. You have to bind that method to the this value of the class. All right, so Danny asked, when would you want to leave it out versus using constructor? What would that be due to wanting, would that be due to wanting just state or just props? Yeah, I mean, it just depends on what you need to do inside of your constructor. Maybe you're doing some other stuff inside of your constructor that's not related to state or props, and you would want to have it in that case. But if you're just setting state, you can obviously just define state on the class itself, like I just showed you. If you don't even need state, if your class is not using state, then you can just leave the constructor out entirely and just not have to worry about it at all. Right? It's completely optional unless you have a specific reason to use it. Like in this case of setting some initial state. In vanilla JavaScript, when we use arrow functions and methods, doesn't this have the opposite effect? This doesn't know what it belongs to in an anonymous function. When you use arrow functions in JavaScript, that essentially just means it's a shorthand for defining a function that's automatically bound to the value of this from its parent function. I know that's kind of confusing. You might want to go read up on that. But essentially, it's an auto binding way to define a function. So it's already bound to the value of this. Okay. So in vanilla JavaScript, I don't think it has an opposite effect. No. I think it would have the same effect because when we use arrow functions in our class, then they're automatically bound to the value of this from the class because it's the parent class, right? Is there a case when you wouldn't use the arrow function, when you would not use the arrow function? Not really. Not that I can think of on the top of my head. Most of the time you can use an arrow function and avoid having to manually bind your method to the class. And most of the time that makes more sense than not using an arrow function. But if you ever come across a situation when you don't want it to auto bind, then that would be a good scenario of when you wouldn't use an arrow function. I can't think of anything specifically right now, but I mean, I'm sure there are cases out there. All right, let's take a look at the render method. So we talked about the constructor. The render method we're already kind of familiar with as well, because we talked about it a lot on Tuesday. But essentially, this is the only required lifecycle method of the component. Okay, this is the only method that you actually have to include on your class component. Otherwise, React will yell at you. You have to have a render method on your class component. It's required. And essentially, when the component renders and re-renders, we return some kind of JSX, right? A piece of the DOM, and React handles everything from there, and persisting it to the actual DOM and everything. We just have to return some JSX. So render is a lifecycle method. Like, you almost don't even think of render as a lifecycle method because you're just returning some JSX. But it's important to know that render is essentially running anytime the component updates, anytime it receives new props, new state. Anytime the component updates, your render method is going to run. And that, because of that, your render method should always be a pure function. All right. So what is a pure function? Explain to me really quick. What is a pure function? Good. Yep, a pure function is a function that doesn't have any side effects, right? It's completely predictable. It returns the same thing every time we call it with the same props. Okay, what's something that would make our render function unpure? What's something specific that would make our component unpure? Or our render method unpure? Side effects, right? Maybe an API call, Axios. Something to do with setting state, right? Any of these things would make our component unpure, and essentially it could potentially crash our app, right? If we called this dot set state in render, explain to me how that would make our application crash. How would calling this dot set state in render make our application crash, and why? Why would this make our application crash? Yeah, essentially we're creating a infinite loop, right? It's just going to keep rendering over and over and over again. Because if you look at our diagram, you'll see that when we call set state, it updates our component. And when our component is updated, our render method is in that process. It's in that flow, right? Render is right here. It's inside of the updating lifecycle, the updating phase. So if we call set state inside of render, then you'll see then it just bumps it back up to the top, and it tries to update it again, and then it goes to render, and it's going to try and set state again, and it's going to bump it back up to the top again, and it's going to essentially infinitely flow through this flow of events. And that's going to make our application crash. Okay, that's why our render function should always be pure. If our render function causes our component to re-render, then we'll be stuck in an infinite loop and our application will crash. Okay. The render function is kind of unique in that it gets called in multiple phases. It gets called in the mounted phase and the updating phase. So it's important for us to keep it pure. All right. Any other questions so far? Let's take a quick break, 5 minutes. And when we come back, we'll look into some new lifecycle events. So take 5 minutes and I'll see you then. Okay, come on back. So Yasir asked, so we shouldn't pass any param to it like render, like a render X or maybe render props. Nope, you never pass any parameters to render. Right, if you want to pass a value to this component, how do you do that, Yasir? If you want to pass some kind of value to this component from another component that's using it, how would you do that? Props, right? You'd pass some props to it, and then how would you access those props inside of this class component? Using this dot props, yep. You'd pass in the props and then you'd access them using this dot props. Okay, your render function doesn't have any parameters to it. No parameters to your render function. Because everything comes through the context of your class that you just access with this. All right, good question. Any other questions before we continue? Make sure you go update your poll, your rating for the poll on how you're feeling about tonight's content. Okay, so let's talk about some new lifecycle events that we haven't implemented yet. Let's implement our component did mount lifecycle event. If we go into, let's go into our item component. If you remember our item component that's just displaying in these red boxes. Let's come into here and let's convert this functional component to a class component. Okay, so let's say instead of const item props, we can say class item extends React component, React dot component. And wrap this whole thing in those brackets, tab that in, and turn that return function into, or nest it inside of your render function. And then take out the semicolon at the end. Okay, so that's converting our functional component to a class component. And then we just have to change all of our calls to props. We just have to change those to this dot props. Okay, since this is a class component instead. Leslie, remember to ask your questions in Slido so they don't get lost. Is it good practice to create variables and functions inside of the render, but out of the return? Yep, that's great practice. If you want to maybe create a variable out here that says const, maybe even you want to like destructure stuff, you could do that. You could say destructure on click and item from this dot props. As long as it's functional, that's the only thing. You don't want to ever have any side effects in your render function. So you can define variables and stuff outside of the return, but inside of the render, you can define maybe like map functions or things that manipulate your data a little bit before you show it. You just have to make sure it doesn't have any side effects, that it will run the same way every time you call it, as long as it receives the same props, right? You want it to be a pure function. So as long as it's pure, then you can define variables and stuff inside of that render function. Does Internet Explorer support arrow functions? If it does not, how does React deal with that? I don't think Internet Explorer supports any of this, to be honest. Especially this JSX, right? This is not valid JavaScript. So how are we running this in our browser if it's not valid JavaScript? Polyfills are one way, Dennis, but there's also another way. It's transpiled, right, through Babel. Essentially, we're taking this React code, we're feeding it through some kind of a transpiler or a compiler, and it's outputting older JavaScript code that will run in Internet Explorer, okay? This code right here, this code that you're looking at right now, this is not going to run in any browser. It won't even run in the newest version of Chrome. Okay, we have to transpile that so that it's actual valid JavaScript. Create React App does that for us. It sets up all of that transpiling automatically for us. But if we were to do it manually, we would set it up through something called Webpack and Babel. They're just transpiling they're just software that transpiles our JavaScript code. Yeah, yep. Create React App is a lifesaver. We used to spend days setting up like Webpack configurations and all of that transpiling configuration, and it was a nightmare. But Create React App makes our lives a lot easier. All right, so let's talk about component did mount. Now that we have our item component converted to a class component, we can now implement our component did mount lifecycle event. You just define component did mount right on the class itself, and we now have access to that lifecycle event. Okay. Remember, this only gets called once in the lifecycle of the component. Or this component did mount, this function is only going to get called once throughout the lifecycle of our component. Calls as soon as the first render gets called. That's it. Okay. It's like React saying, okay, we now have this component and it's been created and it's been mounted. We have the bare bones minimum component to display on the screen. What do we need to do now, right? Maybe you have some bootstrapping code that you want to run. Maybe you want to call an API endpoint. Maybe you want to do something. This is when you would do that. Okay, as soon as the component is kind of ready to go, it's ready to do something else besides just getting created. Okay, and because it runs only once in the lifecycle of the component, it's guaranteed to only run once. We can put asynchronous code and side effects in here. Okay. So this would be like a perfect place to make an API call because we can actually use this .set state in this component did mount. We can call this .set state and it won't produce a infinite loop like it would inside a render. So this is a perfect place to make an API call or to do anything that's some kind of a side effect. Okay, let's log something in here. Let's say console log. Maybe we can say mounted and then output the this.props.item.name. So when this component gets mounted, when the item gets mounted, it should display a log to the console. And look at that. We now see that the bananas item was mounted, tortillas was mounted, milk was mounted, and everything was only mounted once. And even if we change stuff in here, if we change the state, we click on them, they're only mounted once, right? That only got called once, that function. All right, any questions so far? Yep, this is like use effect. It's like the use effect hook. Let's talk about the update and the unmount lifecycle events first, and then we're going to see kind of the differences or how they would map to a functional hooks component. Let's show the difference between creating and mounting a component really quick. We've been talking about this over and over again, but let's actually visualize the difference, all right? I have to think about how I'm gonna do this. So let's say if our shopping list has no items in it, let's say we wanna show like a default item in our list. Okay, so let's come down here before button or after button. And let's say if this.state.groceries, if the length of that array is less than 1, then do a ternary and show maybe just an item component that has just a basic item on it. We can say name is default item, I guess. Okay, so now if our list is empty, it should show our default item, right? So let's empty it out. And you see we now have a default item. But let's take a look at this. So save those files, refresh the inline browser, and you'll see that we have 6 items that were mounted. We have 6 mounted logs, right? Because we have 6 items on the screen. You notice that the default item that hasn't been mounted yet, so that component did mount, it hasn't been called yet. It's created, like it's in the virtual DOM. We have access to it in the memory, but it's just not displayed in the actual DOM, right? It's not mounted yet. And you'll see that once we clear these out so that that item will actually get mounted, then at that point, it then calls mount to default item, right? Because it's now displayed on the screen, it's now in the DOM, it's now been mounted. Okay, so it doesn't actually call that component did mount until it's actually mounted in the DOM. Hopefully that's a little clearer to see like a visual demonstration of what the difference is between creating and mounting. All right, let's take a look at our next lifecycle method, which is component did update. Okay, this is another very important lifecycle event to tie into. You can define it on the class component just like you did with the mount function. You can say component did update. It's like that. Okay. Now this function is going to run every single time our component updates. Anytime it receives new props, anytime it receives new state, it's going to run this component did update method. Okay, let's just log. Let's say console.log. Let's log the same message we did in mount. Just copy that, but then change mounted to updated. Okay, save that. And now look what happens when we click on one of them. When we update that state value, you'll see we now have 6 updated messages. Okay, any idea why we're updating every single one of those items when we only change one of them? Can anybody explain that one to me? Yep, it's because of our map function. Good, Stephen. You look at our map function, you see we're creating, or when we set an item as toggled, or an item is purchased, we're creating an entirely new array and setting that as our state, right? So it re-renders every single one of our items whenever one of them changes. If this was a large system and this was like really complex and there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood, this would probably be considered like a performance bug, right? And we're able to see it really easily just by logging in that component did update lifecycle method. In our case, it's not a big deal because we're only dealing with a small shopping list, right? So it's not a big deal that every item gets updated. But it's also important to note that that's kind of how React works under the hood. Like React is optimized to only update things when they need to be updated. So in our case, it's very performant. We don't have to worry about every single one of those items updating if only one of them updates, right? So if this was a big system, you might want to be able to, you might want to fix that and make it a little bit more performant, but in our case, it works just fine. So now anytime a component, anytime it receives new props or receives new data, our component did update, the lifecycle method will get called. Okay, maybe something in our page, maybe in our component did mount, let's say we make an Axios call to an endpoint and we get some data, right? But let's say something in our component changes that requires us to recall that API endpoint. Then we could do that in component did update as well. Do lifecycle methods ever take in a parameter? They never take in a parameter. Some of them do have parameters that are given to them when they run. The component did update specifically has some parameters that we're going to look at when we actually code our project here in a minute. So yes, some of them do have parameters. All right, now let's look at the last one in our last lifecycle method, component will unmount. Okay, come in here and just define it the same. Say component will unmount. Notice it's will unmount, not did unmount, because we can't run code. We can't tie into a lifecycle event of a component that's already dead, right? It's component will unmount. This is its dying breath. This is going to run right before it gets taken out of the DOM. Let's do the same thing. Let's just console log, copy that line, except change updated to unmounted. All right, component will unmount. Save that. Now go into your page and you can clear out the console so you don't have all this noise. Try clicking on one of them. So we now have raw honey. It's crossed out, right? It's considered purchased. And now click clear purchased. If everything is coded correctly, if we're tied into the lifecycle method correctly, you should see an unmounted raw honey in our console. And boom, there it is. Unmounted raw honey and then updated on all the other ones. So right before our item gets cleared out of the list, right before it gets unmounted from the DOM, it uses its dying breath to call this will unmount lifecycle event. Allows us to clean up stuff. Maybe we want to remove some event listeners, close a WebSocket connection, any kind of cleanup that needs to happen, we can now do in this lifecycle event. Okay, so let's take a look at how this compares to our functional components with hooks. So if we had a functional component that was item, so how would we tie into the constructor? We would use effect, right? You'd use effect. You'd want to make sure you define a dependency array that's empty. So this is where we would tie into the constructor. But also, this is where we would tie into the component did mount. Right, so in functional hooks, in functional components that are using hooks, the constructor and the component did mount are kind of combined into one thing, right? They're combined into that use effect that only runs once when the component is created and mounted. Right, so maybe you have a situation in a complex application where you would have to run different things in the constructor and the mount function. Maybe that would be a good case of when you would use a class component over a functional component with hooks. Okay, how do we tie into the component did update lifecycle method? How do we tie into that one in our hook component? Add a dependency, right? Good. If we just completely left out the dependency array, we just completely left it out, that would be considered the component did update, right? Because component did update runs every single time our component updates, no matter what. But hooks give us kind of an extra feature on top of that that allows us to subscribe to certain things in the array, right? We can subscribe to certain values. But if we just leave that array out completely, then it's exactly the same as component did update. All right, how do we tie into the component will unmount lifecycle event in our hooks function? How do we tie into component will unmount? Dennis, you're killing it with the answers. Good job. I don't see anyone else typing. No, it's a good thing. Dennis speaks for the group, the collective mind of WEBPT8. Good, yep, so if we want to tie into the will unmount lifecycle event with hooks, remember, we just return a function from our useEffect. So we have access to most of these lifecycle functions just right in our using our hooks. But now you can see kind of what those hooks are doing under the hood. They're essentially tying into these lifecycle methods of the component. Cool. That's it. That's all we're going to look at for the life cycle of our component. We now understand the entire life story of our component. Okay, it makes a lot more sense under the hood as to what's happening and when and why and how we can kind of control that. How does returning a function link to the will unmount? That's just the API that hooks give us. So when React team created hooks, they said, okay, if whenever you return a function from useEffect, from that callback, that's going to be considered the unmount function. That will run right before the component gets unmounted. That's just the API that they gave us, all right? Just how it works. So any code that's in here, in this return function from our callback, any code that's in here is not going to run until our component is about to get unmounted, until it's almost dead. What about those get whatchamacallit life cycles? Like, yeah, like these. Get snapshot before update, get derived state from props. Those are ones you don't really have to worry about right now. If you're interested in learning more about them, you can come into this page and just click on them. It should open up the React documentation and you can read about it. Essentially, those allow you to tie into very specific lifecycle events that you don't always need to know about. If you ever need to tie into one of these lifecycle events, you'll know it. Like it'll be completely obvious what you're trying to do. And one of these lifecycle events would probably help you accomplish that. Okay, let's jump into the project for tonight. We're going to build something from scratch that implements some of these lifecycle methods. Now that we understand when they run, we've done some simple logging. That error to go away. So if you want to visualize this, you can always refresh the page and take a look. We're not going to be working in Code Sandbox for the project. We're going to be working from scratch with Create React App. So hopefully your installations are done by now. We've had about an hour to let them finish. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. So the dog website, this is what we're going to build. So if you haven't already, make sure you create React app, dog website, or whatever you want to call it. And then once you have it installed, CD into the folder, CD the dog website or whatever you named your project, and npm install Axios. Okay, make sure you install Axios as well, because we're going to use it as a dependency. Is it important that if I'm using npm that the yarn.lock is deleted? No, it's not important. If you're using npm, it'll just ignore the yarn lock, so you can delete it, you can leave it, whatever. All right, so once you have that done, once you have Axios installed, go ahead and npm start. Just run npm start inside of the project directory, and that will start your React application. It should start it at port 3000. So if you go to this URL right here, this localhost port 3000, just go to that in your browser, and you should see this, just this boilerplate. Okay, and go ahead and open up the folder in your code editor, whatever you're using. Okay, and then go into your source folder. We can actually delete most of this stuff. We don't need a lot of this boilerplate. So let's delete service worker. We don't need that. Let's delete logo.svg. We don't need that. Delete index.css. We don't need that. You can delete app.test. We don't need that. And app.css. We don't need that. So delete everything except for app.js and index.js. Okay, and then go into index and you can get rid of all of the service worker stuff. And you can get rid of the index.css import. So you're just left with these 4 lines: import React DOM, import app, and React DOM.render. All right, and then go into app.js. And you can get rid of app.css import and logo.svg. And in fact, let's just delete this entire function. Just delete the entire app function. And let's write a class component to replace it. So just get rid of that. So we're left with these 2 files. I wish Create React App just gave us this when we initialized, but they insist on giving us some kind of a boilerplate. It's kind of annoying sometimes. Okay, so let's create a basic class component in our app.js. Let's say class app extends react.component. Okay, and what's the one thing every class component needs? What's required? Render function, right? The render function is required in every component. That's the only thing that's required. Okay, and then from our render, we can just return some JSX. Let's just return a blank fragment. Just looks like a blank tag. And then inside of that, let's say an H1, and we'll just say the dog website. If we have time, can we go over importing something like Material UI/core, implementing something like make styles? I don't think we're going to cover Material UI at this point. Maybe in some of the later lectures, we'll get into stuff like that. I mean, there's not too much to it. You just have to npm install the dependency, and then you can import it just by the name. Basically, just following the documentation, you should be able to figure out how to make something like Material UI work. If we do have time, we can go over it, but I doubt we will. Venki, we don't use render in functional components because the function itself is the render function. And Vlad, we'll talk about previous state in just a second. This is part of this project, so patience. All right, so now you should see, if you go to your page, you should see this, just empty white screen with our title. We're not going to worry too much about styling tonight. If you have some time and you want to style this on your own, absolutely feel free. Maybe you can, your project follows this same structure, so you could make your project look a little bit nicer than what we're doing right now. Yep, you can absolutely. Yeah, you can destructure component from React. You can say component destructured and then just say component. That's something a lot of React developers do. All right, now let's, so we have a title, let's add a basic select box. Okay, so let's say we have this website. If you remember the dog API, that's what we're gonna be using. So this is the API that we're gonna call from our application. You'll notice that you can go to the breeds list on the side, in the sidebar. If you go to the breeds list, there are a ton of different breeds of dogs that we can return images for. So what we're going to do is in our page, let's just make a simple drop down that allows us to select a breed. And when you select the breed, it makes a request to the API for a bunch of images and then displays them on the page. Okay. I wonder how that lady feels about being in our lecture. Who is that? Okay, so let's go into our app and let's add a select box so we can choose some breeds. Okay, so let's say select. Let's create some options. I'm gonna change this layout. Let's do an option for Husky. You can choose Huskies. Maybe an option for Beagles. And maybe an option for Corgis. Okay, make sure your options have values. So we'll just have a value with the name of the breed, just all lowercase. So you can say Husky, value equals Beagle, and value equals Corgi. All right, now how do we turn this select into a controlled input? Anybody know? How do we turn this select field? This is currently uncontrolled, right? We have it on our page and it works, but it's not going through React yet. How do we make this a controlled input? We have to set the value and we have to handle the change, right? So let's create some state for our application by adding a constructor. So add a constructor method. Remember to call super, because we want to make sure we call the super, the parent class, so that we get access to like this.props and things like that. And let's define some state. Let's say this.state equals an object. And then let's set the state value of breed. Okay, let's default it to Husky. So now we have a default value of Husky. All right, and then in order to make this select field controlled, we just have to add the value. So we have to say value equals this.state.breed. And then we have to have an onChange method. That is basically this.handleChange. We can call it handleChange. Okay, so if we define that method on the class, handleChange, just define it right below the constructor. Say handleChange equals event, arrow function. Okay, and then how do we set the value of our select to the state inside of that handleChange function? How do we change the state? Set state, right? Good. So let's say this dot set state. And we're going to set breed, just set it to event.target.value. Cool. So now when we change our select field, it should change our React state as well. All right, let's make our API call. Where is the best way to, or where is the best place to make our API call? Which lifecycle method should we tie into to actually make our API call? Component did mount, right? That's where we want to make our initial call. Remember, our input's changing in our page. This can change. So we also want to make the API call when it updates, but we need to make an initial call first when the page first loads. All right, so let's implement component did mount. Someone asked, would component will mount work as well? Dennis, it could, yes. It's not as safe to put stuff in that function because there's a chance that that function will run, but the component doesn't actually mount. Okay, maybe something stops it from mounting. So you want to call a component did mount instead, so you know that the component actually mounted before you run the code. All right, so inside of component did mount, let's make our API call. So go to the top, let's import Axios from Axios. And then inside of our component did mount, let's just make our API call. Let's say axios.get. And the URL is going to be just the URL that dog API gives you right here. You'll see it's https://dog.ceo/api/breed/breed name/images. If you leave out the /random, it'll give you a bunch of images. /random will give you one, but we want a bunch of them. So let's say https://dog.ceo/api/breed/our breed, which is going to be husky/images, right? But we also want to tie our state value into this string, right? We don't want to just hard code husky in there. We want that to be the value of our state. So let's turn this into a template literal. Just change those quotes to backticks. And then in place of husky, you can say $brackets, this.state.breed, like that. So now that will dynamically build that string based off of the current breed name in our state. All right, and then since this is Axios, it's going to return a promise. So we can say .then. It's going to give us a result. And we have to have a .catch to catch any errors. If we get an error, let's just log it out. We'll say console.log error. Just log out the error. Okay, and then let's just log out our result as well. Let's console log our result just to see that we get something. All right, so save that, go into your page, and let's take a look at what happens when we load. Refresh it. If you open up your console, you should see some data coming down from our API. You'll see we have a data object that has a message key that has a list of our dogs, of our images, right? These are JPEGs. So let's set that value. Let's set that array of images. Let's set that to state as well. So maybe we can create another state value called images. Set it to an empty array since we don't have any images initially. And then when the request finishes, when component did mount finishes, we can then set the result, that images array, which is going to be result.data.message. We can set that to our state. Okay. And we do that with this.set state. And we pass through an object and give it the key of images to result.data.message. All right, notice we're calling this.set state in component did mount. Okay, that's not a bad thing. I've tried to drill it into your mind that it's bad to call set state in render, right? Because that forces the component to re-render and it results in an infinite loop. But calling it inside of component did mount is okay, because component did mount only runs a single time, right? So when we call this.set state, it's going to cause the component to re-update, which will then result in component did update getting called. But component did mount will never get called again. All right, Cole, let me, I'll copy this into Slack to make sure you have the right URL. Not sure why you'd be getting a 404. All right, and then the last thing. Oh, does it say breeds instead of breed? Oh, interesting. I see breed right here. I don't see where it says plural breeds. I guess right there, yeah, interesting. Maybe if one of them is 404ing for you, you can try a different one. All right, so now that we have these images, we're setting them in state in that array. Let's just loop over that array and display an image for each item. All right, who can walk me through how to do that? If I wanted to display these images just right below select, let's say I want to display them inside of this div. Nice, Aaron, that was quick. You can say this.state.images.map, right? And then item, each item is gonna, an image. Maybe instead of calling it item, we can call it image, right? Since it's just gonna be a URL to a JPEG. And then we can just display an image tag. We can say image source equals image. Give it an alt and just say dog. I don't know, call it whatever you want. And then remember, if we're looping over stuff or returning something from a map function, we also have to have a key. So we can just use the index value from that map function. Remember, map returns two parameters, one thing that it's mapping over and the current index. And we can just say key equals index. So now if we go to our page, we have a long list of dog images. They're huge. We're going to need some, oh, look at that guy. He's chunky. We're going to need to add some CSS to make these images smaller. Okay, but before we do that, let's take a quick break. 5 minutes, catch up, step away for a minute, and I will see you in 5. Okay, come on back. Kyle, yeah, you have an error, syntax error on line 42. You're missing a parenthesis, an opening parenthesis. Let's see, so why don't the pictures change when we switch breeds? Do we need to hook it up in a different way as well? Yeah, good for noticing. Good on you for noticing. We do need to hook that up to a different lifecycle method, which we're gonna do right before we close. Charlie getting an error message line 44, expected an assignment or function fall. Yeah, post your code in Slack and the group will help you debug. Probably just a simple syntax error. Charlie, you need to return something from your map function, either return the JSX component or wrap it in parentheses instead of brackets, instead of curly braces. Right, so if you're using curly braces, you have to return something. Otherwise, if you're using parentheses, it's an implicit return. All right, make sure you update the poll as to how you're feeling about the content. If you're feeling good, go back and update so you have more stars. If you're not feeling good about it, make sure you vote for one of the lower numbers so I can get a feel for it. Yeah, let's implement some really simple styles, Leslie. Good. Let's copy Leslie's styles and from Slack and see what happens. Well, if you're using styled components, I actually don't have styled components installed. So if you're using styled components, go ahead and copy Leslie's styling and try and mess around with it. I'm just going to create a CSS file. I'll just create a file called app.css or app.css, just right there in the source folder. And I can just say img for image tag. We want to limit the size of these images so they're not gigantic. So maybe we can say max width equal or colon, maybe like 250 pixels, and then a max height of 250 pixels. Then maybe you can give them some padding of like 10 pixels. I don't know. That might make it look a little nicer. And then inside of your index or inside of your app.js, just import /app.css, and that should apply those styles for you. And there we go. Now we can see more dogs at once. Looks a little bit nicer. Loralee, you need an initial value, an initial state value for your images. It should be set to an initial value of an empty array. Okay, see this on line 10 right here? You gotta have that. Otherwise, images will be undefined. All right, so some of you have said, yeah, that the image list doesn't actually update when we change the value. Let's get it to update. Okay, let's get it to update to new images of the new breed when we change that select value. So you'll see that we're running that API call inside of component did mount, right? But what's the problem with this? What's the problem with calling our API endpoint in component did mount? It only runs once, right? Good. Component did mount only runs once in the life cycle of our application. Even if our state changes, this is never going to run again. Okay, so we have to implement another lifecycle method, which is component did update. Okay, component did update will run every single time our component re-renders. Anytime the state changes or it gets new props. In this case, our state, the breed value in our state is changing when we change that select value, which in turn updates our component and re-renders it. So we want to also call our API endpoint in component did update. So we want to call it once in component did mount as the initial run, and then we also want to call it every time that value is updated. All right, so let's extract this. Let's extract this Axios call into its own method so that we can call it more than once. So go ahead and just cut that and then create a method. We'll call it fetch dog images. Maybe we can pass it the breed. And then paste your code in there. Actually, we don't even have to pass the breed. Just leave the parameters list empty. And then you can call fetch dog images in component did mount. You can just say this dot fetch dog images. Okay, and that'll have the same effect. But now we can reuse it inside of component did update. So you see we're still looking good. It's still calling the API and getting the images. And then inside of component did update, so when our select value changes, when we select a different value, we want to call that endpoint again, but with the new state value, the new breed value, right? So let's empty our images list. So let's say this dot set state, and let's set images to an empty array again, so that when we change the value, our list clears out so that we can get new ones, right? Or if you don't want to empty it out, you just want to keep the current images in there, you can do that as well. And then let's call this dot fetch dog images again. All right, so now anytime the component updates, it's calling this dot fetch dog images again. All right, looking at this code, what's a problem? What can you see that could potentially be a problem here? If you save it and look at your page, you'll probably get an error from React that gives you the answer. Nope, there we go, look at that. We got an infinite loop, right? We have an infinite loop because we're calling this dot set state inside of component did update. It was fine when we were calling it inside of component did mount, right? Because that only ran once and it doesn't matter if we update the component, it won't run again. But now we're inside of component did update. So if the component updates, this function runs. And if this function updates the component again, it's going to just run in this infinite loop over and over and over again, right? This is a problem. But React gives us these parameters in this callback function, this lifecycle event. They give us parameters that help us get around to this problem. Parameters, the first parameter is the previous props, and the second parameter is the previous state. These are values that React gives us that says before this component updated, this is what the props look like, and this is what the state looked like, right? So how can we use this? How can we use this data, this knowledge of our previous state? How can we use that to prevent an infinite loop? We can use an if statement, right? We can essentially say if the previous state value of breed, if it's different than the current value of breed, so if previous state breed is different than this dot state dot breed, then we want to refetch the dog images and we want to run all of this code. Okay, otherwise we don't want to do anything. So only if that breed value is different, then we want to refetch the code, refetch the images. Okay, that should fix our infinite loop problem. So now if we go back, you see we default to Huskies, but let's change to a different breed, change to Beagles, and we get a list of Beagles. Look how cute they are. Change it to Corgis, same thing. All right. Works great. Any questions about that, what we just did? So now you can go back into the Dogs API endpoint, and you can implement some different breeds, right? Maybe you want to implement boxers. So let's go into the options and let's add boxer. Option value boxer. Save it, go to your page, and now we have boxer images. Awesome. Let's see, do we need the this.setState breed? Shouldn't this.fetchDog images just overwrite it? Whoever asked that question, I assume you mean set state with images, not breed. Yeah, you can let fetch dog images just override it. Yep, absolutely. You don't have to do this. That's more of a UX thing, right? The only reason I cleared it out is because if your internet is slow and you select a different breed, it might take a minute for those images to actually populate and come through. And if you select something and the images don't change immediately, you might assume, or your user might assume that it's not working. So it's good to just give some kind of a feedback that something's changing or something's happening. Maybe you want to show like a loading indicator or something like that. Okay. Yep, I'll share this code when we're done. Yep. And nope, dang, this is not instead of the GitHub cards. GitHub cards is your project for tonight. So it's going to be very similar to this. So hopefully it shouldn't be too difficult for you. Yeah, so Cole, you can do that. If we didn't have this if statement and we were calling set state, then it would result in an infinite loop, right? But let's walk this through. So, or let's walk through this really quick. So component did update. Well, first it's going to call component did mount. Okay, component did mount fetch dog images. Fetch dog images is going to call set state. Okay, so that will trigger the component to be updated. So the component is now being updated, which means component did update is going to get called, right? And when component did update gets called, this code is going to run. And if we didn't have this if statement, then it would call set state again, and the component would re-render again and result in an infinite loop. But now that we have the if statement, if the component re-renders more than once, but the breed hasn't changed, then it won't run this code, right? Only if the component has updated and the breed has changed, that's when it will run this code. So even when we call set state here, it's still going to come back and update the component, and it's going to run this lifecycle method component did update. But since the breed didn't change the second time around, it's not going to run that code again. It's like adding a dependency array in useEffect. Yep. So yep, that's similar to saying if we had useEffect the same as that, same idea. How do you have one with 2 words like Great Dane? Yeah, it depends on the API. Let's take a look. Great Dane, where is it? I don't see it. Let's do Boston Bulldog. We call the endpoint with Boston Bulldog. You might just have to implement or put a slash instead of a space. I can't get it to work. All lowercase 1 word, maybe that's it. No? Interesting. I don't know how to implement that with a breed that has a space. Maybe they have something in here. Interesting. Maybe an underscore? No. Maybe a dot? I don't know. I don't know what to tell you there. Maybe just don't do breeds that have spaces. I don't see anything in their documentation about it. Oh, there we go. So maybe you just do a slash when there's a space. Oh, no. Or yeah, maybe it would be, you have to reverse it. So it's, there we go. That's what it would be. Okay. So if there's a space like a Boston Bulldog, then you want to reverse it so that the breed goes first and then the subbreed. Cool. That's only if you want to use a breed that has a space in it. If that whole process just confused you, just use breeds that don't have spaces. That's just dependent on the API that you're using. I don't think you'll have problems like that with the GitHub API. But when in doubt, just look at the documentation, right? The documentation will usually answer your question, even if you have to dig a little bit. You'll eventually find your answer. Okay. Things are looking good. Any last minute questions? So you're going to be working on the GitHub user card project. Put that in Slack. Favorite dog? Loaded question. I don't know. I like all dogs. Okay. I'll push all this up to GitHub, and good luck with your projects tonight. Have a good night, everyone.